Hello, and welcome to the Brave New Weed podcast. And now, here's your host, Joe Dolce.
Welcome to another episode of the Brave New Weed podcast. How's that for a seductive entry?
That was great, Joe.
Thank you. Matthew, welcome back.
Thank you so much. It was good to be traveling around, but it's good to be back.
Let's talk about all of the news that seems to be happening. The basic news is legalization is going to occur. Wouldn't you say, if you were to sum this up?
Oh, and not only do I wholeheartedly agree, but I think it's going to happen even quicker than the even quicker that we all expected. We've been saying it's going to happen faster than anyone expects for a long time. I think that now we're starting to see big signals that it's going to be like...
Quick summary, the House is doing a bipartisan measure to sort of take away penalties federally. Trump says he'll support it. Even Texas Republicans are supporting legalization in Texas.
I saw the news in Texas. That's great. I know that the Republican Party, Texas still has like a kind of an old school Republican Party where they're about personal freedom, and they hold on to that. The sort of neoconservative take is a bit more chimed in, but I like that Texas is really standing up for the old Republican ideals.
And even the governor of New York City, of New York State, the extraordinary Andrew Cuomo, had this great thing to say about the legalization of cannabis. He said, it's not it's that the facts have changed about cannabis. That's why I'm now supporting legalization. After 12 or some ridiculous number of years of stalwart opposition, he thinks the facts have changed.
Well, I think the facts have changed, but the facts that have changed are that he has a real competitor for his job.
Yes,
the facts about cannabis are still what they've always been.
Yes, that's exactly right. Well said.
Before we get out of news, let's talk about the big global piece of news, which is that Canada has finally done it. Fulfilling a 2015 campaign promise by Justin Trudeau, they have legalized cannabis in Canada. Only the second country in the world to do so.
It's remarkable, really, and it's going to push this country even closer because we have to compete, right?
Yeah, I don't know how it can't. When you talk about medical markets, when you talk about recreational markets, hell, even tourism, you don't think that everybody in the United States is going to want to go to Canada and hang out now?
You think Trump is going to put an import duty on cannabis from Canada?
Sure, he'll try. The date has officially been set. October 17th. Will be the day that you can walk right into a dispensary and walk out with your bud.
I'm not sure there's dispensaries in Canada. When I first was reading their laws, there weren't going to be any dispensaries. It's going to be all through the mail.
Oh, you don't think they'll have it worked out?
I can't remember if they figured it out or not, but we'll be looking into that as we go forward, certainly.
Either way, October 17th, definitely a date to mark on your calendar if you're in Canada or planning to go.
Now, can we talk about me?
Absolutely. What's up, Joe?
So I did, a couple of weeks ago, I went out to California and I did a talk on my favorite topic, which is getting relief without the high. But it was part of this Green Flower Media Summit. And Green Flower Media pulled together 10 really impressive speakers. And we spent a day presenting to each other about different topics on cannabis. It was sort of like a TED Talk for the cannabis business.
Like a whole bunch of TED Talks.
There were 10 of those.
A whole summit.
It was amazing. And some of the topics were how to properly do microdosing, cannabis in women and cannabis in seniors, the future of hemp and CBD, how cannabis can replace opiates and pharmaceuticals, and the evolution of cannabis edibles. So it was a really great day, and I was super impressed with my colleagues who were on the stage with me. But the reason I'm telling you this is because until July 2nd, anyone can go on to greenflowermedia.com and hear the entire summit for no money.
That's great.
And after July 2nd, it will cost some pennies. But up until then, it is free. So I just wanted to alert our listeners that go on to greenflowermedia.com and check out this summit. Of course, listen to my speech first, but listen to other people speak, because again, they were an impressive group, and it's great to see this kind of group of men and women, highly practiced, highly accredited, come out and start talking about these topics.
Absolutely. I'm particularly interested, aside from yours, to hear the evolution of edibles, because that's something that I have a personal interest in.
It is a topic to your own heart.
And I'm very vocal about, so I will be checking that out as well.
Our email address is bravenewweedcast@gmail.com, and we really like to hear from our listeners and our supporters. So if there's an issue, if there's a question, if there's something you'd like us to pursue or like us to be aware of, please email us. Again, it's bravenewweedcast, C-A-S-T, @gmail.com. Our guest this week is Dr. Dustin Sulak. Dustin is a doctor of osteopathy, and he's also a cannabis clinician. And over the last few years, he's been researching the effect of cannabis on opioid addiction and withdrawal. And the effects are amazing, as a matter of fact. Very few people know that cannabis works synergistically with opioids. In other words, you can take cannabis and actually decrease the amount of opioids you need to get your pain relief. They accelerate each other, which is great, and it allows you to cut down. It also allows you to withdraw from opioids in a more civilized and less painful way. Mm-hmm. He's also come up with other amazing information that I really want the mainstream to know about, because this is a solution staring us in the face of a crisis that's killing 115 Americans alone each day, opioid addiction. And people are really suffering because really, prescription drug makers have been pushing these pills onto the population for a good 10, 20 years, often with misinformation and often with claims of, it's really easy to get off of these things. But if anybody happens to have an opiate prescription, you know that those drugs are really difficult to get off of. So I really am really happy that Dustin's agreed to join us again to talk about this really pressing and really fascinating issue. So pay attention, listen to what he has to say. I think it's great. Dustin, I'm so happy that you're back with me so soon. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Joe. Really thankful to be back on the show, and I had a great day in the clinic today. I love my patients and have a lot of fun in the work I do. I feel really blessed.
Yeah, you are. You're really lucky. I feel the same. Good for you. I want to talk a lot about opioids and cannabis because I know you're one of the smartest people on the topic. But let's start with how you started looking at the relationship between these two compounds and how they maybe work together a little bit, please.
Sure. Well, I think my first exposure to this topic was when I was in residency. And I had a lot of patients that were coming in for more and more opioids to treat chronic pain. This was something that we just had a lot of in the residency clinic, which did a lot of work with the state Medicaid system. And so there's a lot of overlap with poverty and poor health and, other conditions. But what I noticed is that most of my patients kept coming back every 3 or 6 months, and the opioids were no longer effective for treating the pain, and they needed a higher dose. And it was a really tough situation to be in because, in our training, we learned that if we keep giving them a higher dose, in the end, it's going to make their pain worse and cause a lot of other problems. But in the short run, and when it comes to the practicality of a clinical encounter, here's a person that's telling you honestly, truthfully, that if we don't increase their dose, they're not going to be able to work. They're not going to be able to support their family. And so it's a tough situation to be in. But then every once in a while, I noticed that there were some patients who had been on the same low dose, say like oxycodone 5 milligrams 3 times a day for years or even a decade. And I thought, look, what's different about this person? Why are they not coming back saying, I want more and more? And, one concern is, are they diverting the medicine and not taking it? But I had a therapeutic relationship with a few of these folks, and I started asking, and more than one knew the answer. It wasn't like a mistake. It wasn't something they just fell upon by chance. It was really clear, and it seemed to me that it was known out there in the community that if you use cannabis in conjunction with the oxycodone or whatever opioid it is, you'll be less likely to build tolerance to it. And I remember clearly one patient took it right out of his pocket, and he said, "Here's the answer to your question." He shoved it in my face so that I could smell it, and it smelled great. And and that's really where it got started. I realized, like, oh wow, there's this huge problem in medicine, and there's a solution that's like in that moment, pun intended, was sitting right under my nose. And And then when I left residency and I started a private practice for several years, about 75 to 80% of my patients that were coming in for cannabis recommendations had chronic pain. And, I'd say roughly a quarter or a third of those were already on opioids when they came to me. Now, I have a lot of selection bias in my practice, which means by the time someone is sitting in my office talking to me, they're already different than what a lot of other doctors are exposed to, right? They are determined to get off of medications. Often they're more interested in a holistic or natural type of healthcare. They're fed up or distrusting of conventional medicine. And so I was seeing a lot of patients in that boat who were taking opioids and they wanted to get the hell off of the opioids, but they didn't know how. And when they had tried in the past, their pain was worse. And so they were coming to me to learn how to use cannabis to do this. Some of them had already been using cannabis in conjunction with the opioids and not getting the results that I was seeing in other people. And so then it became a question of, well, how can we change the use pattern of cannabis and maybe also the use pattern of the opioid drug to get you the same results that I'm seeing in some of my other patients who are really using cannabis very effectively to discontinue or significantly reduce their opioid drugs.
What'd you learn about that, changing the use pattern?
Well, the number,
on your own?
yeah, the biggest thing is like so many people were alternating. They were trying to figure out, like they're trying to decide, should I take the cannabis now? Or should I do the opioid now? And we're scared to use them together because, of course, there's a lot of fear about using opioids together with other drugs like benzodiazepines. But so that was the first trend that I noticed. The people that were doing really well were the people that were putting these two drugs into their body at the exact same time instead of alternating them.
Tell the audience what a benzodiazepine is.
A benzodiazepine is a muscle relaxant and anti-anxiety drug. Valium is the most well-known, but also Klonopin and Ativan, that whole class of medications that's frequently prescribed in conjunction with opioids, either for the muscle relaxant effects related to chronic pain, for sleep, or for anxiety. And the problem with combining these two classes of medications is that they both suppress breathing and heart rate. And this is where they get dangerous because you start stacking up this suppression and people can die. It's a major cause, major factor in these high numbers of opioid deaths. You hear about like 115 a day. Well, a lot of those deaths are confounded because there was a benzodiazepine involved.
I don't want to get off the topic, but I have read that a lot of doctors don't even know their patients are on benzodiazepine. So they're sort of double dosing without knowing.
Right. Well, they might be getting one drug from the psychiatrist and another drug from the pain specialist. Thankfully, this has happened in Maine, and I think it's happening in other states where we're able to use technology to have like prescription drug monitoring programs to avoid some of those issues. But that had been a big problem.
So I want to go back to opioids, though. When you and I were talking at one point, you told me a very interesting thing, that states with medical cannabis laws and functioning programs have a lower rate of opioid dependence, whether or not the programs were in effect. Now,
well, am
I getting that right?
Yes, you are getting that right. What I would change is not whether or not the programs are in effect. Like the data that's looked at has used time points related to like the opening of a dispensary or the passage of a law that allows home cultivation. But what a lot of these laws didn't specify is that you can actually use cannabis to treat opioid dependence or addiction. So, like Maine, for example, if someone doesn't have chronic pain or PTSD, it's not even legal for me to treat them with cannabis. But despite that, there's been a huge reduction in opioid deaths, hospitalizations, and so forth just since passing the cannabis law here. So even when cannabis isn't directly utilized to treat opioid addiction or dependence, it's still having this net beneficial effect. And it's not just having that effect on opioids, it's having that effect on the anti-anxiety drugs, the antidepressant drugs, even on the seizure drugs to some extent. So we're seeing like this global substitution happening towards cannabis. But out of all the drug categories, it's happening the very most with the opioids.
Thanks for the clarification. But is that saying that patients are naturally finding their way to it even without guidance?
Yes, I think so. Well,
Help me understand.
yeah.
Help me
Even so,
understand this, because it's so random. It seems so unlikely to me. But tell me.
well, I think the opioid thing is a scourge on people's lives. It really people go and typically they start to polarize into I hate this drug and I want to do whatever I can to get off of it, or I don't have the strength or energy to get off it. I just want more and more, and those two things can be mixed as well. But I think that people are widely recognizing, even before folks like me started bringing more attention to this issue. Like I think it was more in like the underground community, like my patients that I saw in residency, that were talking about, yes, if you add cannabis to opioids, you get these beneficial results. And so I think this has been something that's been kind of simmering in the underground, and then finally like really came out into the open at the same time that cannabis came out into the open with the liberalization through medical and adult use laws.
Now, there have been some other studies talking about the synergies that you were talking about. Can you tell me a little about them, please, and tell the audience about the studies and what they showed? Because I thought that was really interesting. I think you do too.
Sure. Well, so there's this huge, long history of animal research that shows if you take a dose of, say, morphine in a rodent and you add THC to it, the morphine becomes way more powerful. Same thing with all the, several other opioids. And then just last year, there was a paper that was published that reviewed all of that old data that started in the late 90s. And they found that, in summary, the effective dose of morphine when combined with THC is 3.5 times lower than the effective dose of morphine by itself. The effective dose of codeine when combined with THC is over 9 times lower than the effective dose of codeine by itself. Right. So
Wow.
you can take a tenth of this stuff if you combine it with THC and get the same amount of pain relief. And it's not just that the THC is giving the pain relief, like the THC does, but it doesn't give that full effect. It's really this combination that was so impressive in the animal literature, but that really hadn't been studied much in humans until this year. And this was Ziva Cooper out of New York did a study where she took people without chronic pain, healthy cannabis using individuals, and she brought them in for 6 different sessions where they were exposed to these various treatment conditions. Basically, they got either a placebo oxycodone, a 2.5 milligram oxycodone, or a 5 milligram oxycodone. And then they also got either real cannabis or placebo cannabis. And so, all the permutations of that lead to 6 treatment conditions. And basically what she found, and so what did these people have to do after they use these pain relieving drugs or placebo? Stick their hand in a bucket of ice water and hold it there as long as they can. And they tell you when they're feeling pain, and then they also take their hand out when they can't take the pain anymore. And so those were kind of the 2 experimental measures of pain tolerance, or what we would think of as pain relief related to the drug. And she showed that the 2.5 milligram dose of oxycodone by itself did not change the test. It did not provide pain relief. And that's probably why there's no 2.5 milligram oxycodone pill available at the pharmacy. The lowest dose you can get at the pharmacy is 5. But what she also showed is that 2.5 of oxycodone plus cannabis did change the test. And that's so basically showing that you can take a subtherapeutic or ineffective dose of oxycodone and make it effective by combining it with cannabis. And I'll just mention that the type of cannabis that was used in the study came from the federal government supply, and it was extremely poor quality. I think like 5.5% THC by weight. And so, if we can achieve that with like this really low grade herb, imagine what we could do with some of these incredible medicinal strains of cannabis that have a lot more than just THC in there, many synergistic components that can decrease pain, spasticity, and things.
That's amazing. And you're not talking about massive doses of cannabis, right? You're talking pretty measured small doses. Am I correct?
Yes, absolutely. They were allowed to smoke, and they were doing, I can't remember exactly what the protocol was, but there was definitely a protocol. It was like a certain number of puffs over the course of like a half hour or something like that. But no, they could smoke the whole thing to their head, and it wouldn't make a big difference because it was such low quality cannabis. So these were low doses of cannabis overall.
Dustin, can you explain in simple terms for people like me, please, how cannabis interrupts pain signaling? Does it interrupt pain signaling? How does cannabis actually mitigate pain?
Great question. There's a variety of ways that it does this. So, one is by taking the brakes off of a system that we already have that stops pain signaling. So we have what's called the descending pain inhibitory system. And what this system does is when we experience pain, we want to be able to like take our hand off the burner, right? We really want to feel the pain. But then after we're out of the threat or after that initial pain insult, it's beneficial for us to turn down that signal, right? We don't want to continue to have strong pain signaling even after the hands off the burner. And so this descending system, descending meaning from the brain down towards the body, then it turns on. And it doesn't shut down the pain signaling all the way, but it turns it way down. Well, cannabis makes that system work even better. So that's one way that it works, by just shutting down the pain signaling that's coming up from the part of the body that was injured. The other main way in which cannabis works to decrease pain signaling is right at the site of the injury. So the nerve fiber that senses the pain and eventually will turn on and send that pain signal up to the brain, that nerve fiber is sensitive to a number of different stimulators. Well, they're called activators and sensitizers. These are things that are released from like the burn, the tissue that actually got damaged. They're released from the immune cells that are secreting inflammatory substances around the site of the injury. And so there's numerous sources of these chemicals, messengers that turn on that pain signaling nerve. Cannabis and some of the terpenes in cannabis work right there at the site of the injury to make it so that nerve is less likely to fire and to prevent the activity of these pain signaling molecules that turn the nerve on in the first place. And that's called the ascending system. So we really have cannabis taking the brakes off and turning on that descending inhibitory system, and we have cannabis decreasing the signaling that's ascending towards the brain. It's a beautiful combination.
That is the most coherent explanation of cannabis and pain I've heard in my life. Thank you. But tell me something else. So that's not, is it doing something different from opioids? Are they doing different things in combination, or are opioids are they amplifying what opioids do?
So the opioids don't do much on that ascending signal like we talked about. They they're not really, those opioid receptors and the opioid signaling isn't present there. The opioid system is very much present in the descending pain signaling system and in the part of the brain that interprets the signal as pain. So like in the research, there's a saying that pain isn't pain until it reaches the brain, right? It's a sensory input. It reaches the brain, it goes into the pain centers of the brain, and then we perceive it as pain. Both opioids and cannabis can affect that perceptual judgment, we could call it, that this is pain. And then after the brain perceives it as pain, all these other things happen, right? We judge that the pain is a bad thing, that we're going to need to avoid that pain. We start getting anxious that we're going to be in pain for the rest of our lives, and then all these behaviors start occurring, and we go into fight or flight mode because we're in pain, and the muscles get all tense, which makes the pain worse. There's this whole kind of snowballing effect. And so this is classic for both cannabis and opioids, for people that treat their pain with these drugs, to say, well, I can actually still feel the pain, but the pain isn't as bothersome. And I hear that a lot with cannabis. You'll also hear that with opioid drugs. But I think one of the differences is that the opioid drugs tend to do it in a way that makes people feel disconnected from their body. So like they'll pop an oxycodone and go mow the lawn, and they'll feel fine while they're mowing the lawn. But then, 4 hours later when it wears off, they're really paying for it. Or in Maine, it's shoveling snow. But the cannabis is it's different, because even though it's making the pain signaling less bothersome, they're still typically in touch with their body, and they know like what's overdoing it and what's safe for them to do. Right. So I think the first thing is to set appropriate goals for treatment, right? This is, I just, when I say appropriate, I want people to have milestones that they can actually reach and feel good about. So if someone's goal is to like be pain-free and, do all these things that are unreasonable, then that's setting up for failure. So I think an appropriate goal, like I want to be able to pick up my grandson, or, I just want to be able to walk half a mile. Let's pick a good goal. And then, what I'm going to summarize for you, I also want to mention is on my patient education website, healer.com, and we have an opioid guide, which is basically how to use cannabis to reduce and replace opioids. And there's a lot of great info in there. We won't have time to cover it all on the show tonight, but here are the basic steps. So number one, like I mentioned, always use the cannabis and the opioids together. And when I say cannabis in this sense, I'm talking about something that's THC dominant. It can have CBD in it as well, but it's not going to work well, in my experience, for it to be just CBD or like some hemp-based CBD product. You really want the THC there as well. And I usually recommend people take it by mouth, because if you're using only inhaled cannabis, you have to keep repeating the dose like every few hours, maybe even as often as every 1 to 2 hours. People start chasing their pain around instead of preventing it, and it's always way better to prevent it. And so the opioid drug you're taking has this kind of, we'll call it 4 to 12 hour duration of action. You'd like the cannabis to have a same duration of action, so you can have the THC and the opioid in your blood at the same time, working on the receptors at the same time, and teaming up together to have the synergistic effect on pain. I save the inhalation. So that's step one. Take an oral dose of the cannabis that contains THC with the opioid. Always use them together. Never let that opioid pass your lips without some cannabis going in with it. And you can use some of the programs on healer.com to figure out what's the right dose for you if you don't know it already. And then the step two is to save inhaled cannabis for when you really need it, which in my opinion would be breakthrough symptoms and to reduce cravings. So this is, I just did something or I'm having a spasm, or I'm really stressed out today and my muscles are tight and my pain is worse. Like, or for some people that have pain, they don't know what the heck caused it, but there's some days or hours or minutes where the pain is way worse. You can take a puff or 2 or 3 of cannabis and have this incredibly rapid relief. So that's where inhaled cannabis really shines. And then the other one is when people are trying to taper down their opioids, and when they're doing it successfully, even the most strong-willed, successful people in this endeavor still have periods where they're watching the clock and they're thinking, gosh, I'm supposed to wait another 3 hours until I take my next pill, but the pain's getting worse already. I feel the last pill wearing off because I just cut my dose down 2 days ago, and and it's hurting. And they literally sit there and watch the clock. It's no way to live. And if they take a few puffs of cannabis, 3 hours pass by and they don't even notice. Like it can really cut through those cravings and allow for the successful like repatterning of their lifestyle and repatterning of their relationship with the opioid drugs. So that's what I use inhaled cannabis for, and it works so well for that. 2 more steps. One is to think of the cannabis as something that can augment other things that are therapeutic. So meditation, prayer, journaling or reflecting, exercise is a huge one for people that can tolerate it. And I believe that everyone can tolerate some type of exercise. So I really like people to frame their cannabis as something not only that relieves pain, but can supercharge the rest of their therapeutic activities. It absolutely can do this. And I just also want to mention that opioid drugs relieve pain. Like that's their effect on the body. Cannabis also relieves pain, but what else does cannabis do, right? It's a antispasmodic, so it relaxes the muscles, it improves the mood, it relieves anxiety, it decreases inflammation. And so it's like coming at the problem at many different levels, not just by mitigating the symptom, but by actually getting much closer to the cause. So those are 3. And then the last one, which is very important, it might as well be the first one, is to use cannabis to promote regular restorative sleep. If anyone wants to replace their opioid drugs, and they're going to need good sleep. This is, for healing pain, for getting their brain to function better, getting their brain better able to make their own endorphins, their inner pharmacy's version of the opioid drugs, and also the endocannabinoids, the inner pharmacy's version of the cannabis. Sleep is essential, and cannabis can really promote sleep. So that means finding the right sleepy strain, not a stimulating strain, finding a good oral dose, whether it's like a 10 or 15 milligram capsule or maybe even more, whatever it takes. Keep adjusting the cannabis until sleep is top notch.
Dustin, is there research that backs up your observations, or is this primarily your own study through practice over the years?
Well, I think the details are primarily my own. There's a lot of research that's looked at patients who are using opioids that start using cannabis and follows up with them 6 or 12 months later and says, how many opioids are you using? And we see profound changes there. Like studies typically show around 40% of people right there after 6 months are able to be completely off their opioids. And these aren't people that were on opioids for no good reason. Most of these studies are on people that have chronic pain for a good reason. They're using opioids that were prescribed by the doctor, and they get off of them. 40% get off, and another 40%-ish usually reduce their dose. The data from Maine shows that, from Michigan, from Israel. It's been replicated many times. So I think there's a good trend there. But most of these studies don't say, like, what were the details? How were you using cannabis? That information comes from my experience.
True or false? Can cannabis help disrupt the opioid crisis?
True. 100% true. We have evidence for this, really solid evidence at the epidemiologic level. It already has disrupted the opioid crisis. We have the proof. So and then let me add this, Joe. If it's already disrupted the crisis, and most of our medical programs are not, they don't even indicate that opioid addiction is something that can legally be treated with cannabis, and there's no education about how to best use cannabis to disrupt the opioid problem. Like, imagine what we could do if we had a team approach. Like, if we had addiction medicine, and we had pain medicine, and we had the various state governments and their funding and their programs that they're working so hard on right now to come up with something that's going to make a dent in this problem. What if we had everybody working together? And imagine the results we could get, because it's like we're just shooting an arrow up into the sky hoping we hit something, and we're hitting big time right now. I think with a little more target practice, we could do much better.
I want you to be leading that charge. You are leading that charge. I'm really happy to have heard all you have to share today. It's really great. What do you need to get the team to make a team? What do you need?
Oh man, what do I need? Is this really on my shoulders, Joe? I thought you were going to take care of this one.
It's too big. It's too big. It's too
we can all, but that's the thing. We can all start, like, whether it's me as a doctor or each of us as a patient. So it's the answer is the exact same that it's been in the cannabis liberation movement for the last 50 years. The answer is education. This is actually all we need. We have to keep talking about this. People have to share the opioid guide from my website. In the scientific community, we have to circulate these papers that keep coming out that show the benefits. We just have to keep talking and keep educating. And I also want to keep that education authentic and accurate. Cannabis right now is going through a huge transition where it's moving somewhat more away from this artisanal kind of homegrown underground market type environment into more of like a corporate, standardized, almost pharmaceutical type world. And I think that, I trust in cannabis. I think that it can survive that journey for sure. But I also want to point out that if you look at the number one cause of healthcare expenditure right now, that cause is tobacco. Killing hundreds of thousands of people a year, wasting billions of dollars in the hospital. And what is tobacco? Tobacco is a healing herb. It's actually a very safe, healthy medicine that when it's used appropriately in the right setting. But what we've done as people is recognize, wow, we can really exploit tobacco to make a lot of money, and when that happens, it becomes a very dangerous relationship that ends up biting us back in a big way. Well, the same exact thing has happened with the opioids. Opium is a very safe, very effective drug, and it's a gift from Mother Earth that helps us with especially acute pain, but also chronic pain. But look what we've done to the opium poppy and made it into these highly addictive drugs, again, for the purpose of making money. And so I think we have to recognize that cannabis is at this transition zone. And what can we do? Well, we can learn a lot from tobacco and opium, I think. And one of the things we can learn from is honesty and transparency in marketing. Because for years, the pharmaceutical industry convinced doctors that it's totally safe to load people up on opioids for chronic pain. And the same type of lies were present in the early marketing for tobacco. So let's not assume that cannabis is totally harmless, and let's not assume that it's the perfect solution to the opioid crisis. It's a part of the solution. I don't want to overinflate it or mislead anyone. And then it's all about, so I mentioned education and honesty in the education, and then we can all make choices at the individual level that will help with this. And I think some of these choices are along the lines of what I just mentioned, like, for example, supporting smaller businesses, supporting a competitive marketplace, supporting businesses that have ethical cannabis production practices, ethical distribution and marketing practices. Don't always buy the cheapest thing from the soon-to-be monopoly organization that's taking over. That's easy to do, but that's going to make it a lot more dangerous. And then one other thing that I really want to mention is for people that are in the cannabis industry, for people that are thinking about starting cannabis businesses, we need to have recognition of the harm of cannabis prohibition that we're still that's not done yet. There's still people sitting in jail, rotting away from essentially doing a community service and bringing cannabis to their community, even when it was illegal. We have people that can't get student loans, people that are on probation, and all sorts of racial disparities from cannabis prohibition that have made long-term, difficult to reverse impacts on certain communities. And I think that if we think we can move forward with cannabis in a way that's healthy and supportive to this planet and to our species, we have to look back at our history and fix some of these problems. Otherwise, we're just going to be repeating ourselves.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I thank you for adding that. It's not often said, and I'm happy you did. Dustin, thanks again for your thoughts and for your time. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Joe. Thanks for having me. Anytime. Let me know whatever we can do to spread the word and educate. This is really important. Thanks for covering this topic.
Hey listeners, we hope that you are enjoying the Brave New Weedcast. We're happy to bring you new episodes every opportunity we can. You know what you could do for us? You could share the Brave New Weedcast with somebody else who might be interested. I'm sure you have friends, maybe family, who have experienced pain, stress, anxiety. Who knows? Please, if you think you can help, share the podcast with them. We'd love to welcome them to the Brave New Weed world.
I really hope that everybody who listens to this podcast can share it with a medical provider they know, because the information is persuasive and powerful. All the research is cited. It's all online. It's all available. And Dustin's website, healer.com, has an awful lot of information as to how patients themselves can use cannabinoids to lessen their agony, lessen their withdrawal.
Well, and it's an interesting take, Joe, to think about using both in conjunction with one another. I think the talking point for a long time is using cannabis for pain instead of an opioid, or however that might play out for whatever condition it might be. But the idea that you can use them both in conjunction, or that you can use it as an exit if you already have established an opioid addiction problem, I think is something that gets not enough attention. So it's great to see him bringing this to light.
It's information that's just coming out, but this is a real disruption in a cycle. It has really been torturing and making life difficult for not only patients but medical providers too. Everybody's suffering with this.
And it mirrors another thing that I recently read about cannabis and alcohol. Cannabis making alcohol more potent to the body. If you smoke first, it tends to make you drink less, and the alcohol has more of a potent effect. So it's actually, they're seeing consumption of alcohol go down. It's kind of mirroring that. So obviously the opioid one is much more important in terms of addiction, but I think that, knowing that it's an off-ramp.
Listen, final point is that what you're saying about alcohol could be one of the explanations the beverage industry has been so anti-cannabis for so long.
It's
Anything that lowers their consumption is not going to be the most popular thing on the block. So let's all pay attention and let's talk about this. Spread it around. That's all I can say is spread the information. This is great information. More people need to know it.
Listeners, we thank you for joining us on this episode. Just like every episode, we do have some updates for you out there in the internet landscape. The Brave New Weed podcast has now expanded and is available on several new different platforms, not to mention now available also on YouTube. So if you are out there, obviously you can subscribe to iTunes and Google Play Music, but also now you can find the Brave New Weed podcast on the Stitcher Podcast Network and on the iHeartRadio Podcast Network. And then, of course, YouTube.com. And now, here, listeners, is where you come in. For us to be able to claim the YouTube URL of youtube.com/bravenewweed, we have to verify 100 subscribers to the podcast channel on YouTube. And that will allow us to get the custom URL that will allow you to share it with all your friends and family. Right now, our URL is some crazy string of random numbers and letters. I don't even know how to start. But if you just simply go to YouTube and look for the Brave New Weed podcast in the YouTube field, and it will direct you directly to our channel where you can subscribe. And once we hit that 100 subscriber threshold, we will immediately fix our URL so that everyone can find us on YouTube.
Thanks for listening to the Brave New Weed podcast. This episode and all future episodes are made possible by amazing listeners like yourself. If you like what you've heard, we encourage you to show your support by giving $1 a month for special access and rewards on patreon.com/bravenewweed. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram via @bravenewweed. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/bravenewweed. And remember, you can always find more information about us or information discussed in each episode by pointing your favorite browser to bravenewweed.com.